all met down in the Tenderloin, and we basically walked the neighborhood. We spent about 2.5 hours, almost 3 hours, walking the neighborhood, uh, talking to various people on the street, and also doing outreach to businesses in the community and to a couple of different SROs in the community to try to get the word out to the community people that are living there that are both housed and unhoused about the street level drug dealing task force and the work that we're trying to do around making recommendations to reduce harm in the community. We actually had, it was great. We walked through there. We had it's just funny, between Portia and myself, we knew so many people out on the street. We were interacting with so many people out on the street. So it was really cool to be down there. It was kind of a rush to be with someone like Portia. I wish she was here so she could follow up and also talk about it as well. How we both see this community as a really vibrant community. It's like I get a rush when I go down there, and it's not because I want to go do drugs. I'm already over that part of it. It's because it's a really great community. It's vibrant. There's a lot of action. There's a lot of stuff going on, and it's a great place to be. But it also has this underlying constant trauma that's being inflicted upon the residents of this community because, in large part, of the massive drug issue that's happening down there. The street level drug dealing was completely out of control when we were down there, like it is every day. The people using, it was completely out of control. I mean, everybody that I saw using, and I think Sasha, you can back me up on this, was pretty much had a piece of foil in their hand and they were using fentanyl, and that's a big concern. But the point of our walk through the neighborhood and our outreach was to inform the community that San Francisco, as a larger body, is taking steps to try to do something to lessen the harms to that community and help that vibrancy kind of shine through all of that. And I think that with more community engagement and more visibility of this task force and the people on this task force, that even though we maybe look at things differently on the street about what's going on, we all are in agreement that we need to work together to come up with these solutions. Regardless of where our position really is on the street level drug dealing, we all agree that it does harm, but we also agree that we need to try to save lives. And so I'm willing, and I think Portia was too, and Sasha too, that we're all willing to, put whatever ideological differences we might have aside and all work together. And that's something that this task force frankly needs to do as well, so that we can kind of come together and make some compromises and put some really successful, attainable and thoughtful solutions forward to the Board of Supervisors. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So we'll keep moving into the agenda, and just as a heads up, I forgot to mention, after we'll have Sam speak, I'm going to introduce Sam, then we'll open it up for discussion. And I just want to remind folks, in the spirit of working together in the touchstone agreements, making sure to leave space for each of your colleagues to speak. So we're going to implement a 2-minute speaking rule. Rules sound very not great, but you get what I mean, just to leave space for everyone. If you get to your 2 minutes, you're going to hear me do this. And that's just a way to gently say that you have spoken and we have heard everything that you had to say, and we'd like to leave room for the next person to speak. So with that, so Sam Dennison has been living and working at Faithful Fools for 10 years at the intersection of Turk and Hyde. Faithful Fools has been a place of community building, accompaniment, and education for over 20 years. Sam and Faithful Fools coordinated and hosted a Tenderloin Community Council and other resident organizations. Sam and the rest of the Fools are committed to witnessing and addressing the deteriorating conditions of the streets and facilitating personal and collective responses that will make things better. And Sam is going to present a framework for the Tenderloin Community Council. And just say, for folks that aren't familiar with frameworks, frameworks that are a way to ensure that there's a common thread or a common strategy that really helps guide different but coordinated approaches to tackling a complex issue. So with that, Sam, it's all you.
All right. Would you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Just so I can, cool beans. All right. Everything's working then. So I'm Sam Dennison, and I want to take a moment here to honor a tradition that came out of the Tenderloin Community Council. And that is, I'm going to ask you to just take a moment with me of quiet. And during that moment of quiet, I want you to think about all the people who have lived in San Francisco and even lived on our little peninsula long before there was a San Francisco, before people visited and came here from Europe and other parts of the world. And let us honor all of those people who are our collective ancestors. And remember, they had conflicts and they worked on those conflicts. Some were successfully resolved, others were not. And we must learn from both their successes and their failures. So give yourselves just a moment to think on all of those ancestors who are supporting us tonight. And so it is we've come to believe, and we used to say this all the time, we have come to believe that out of a moment of quiet, we can listen to one another just a little bit better. And I also want to say thank you, Sasha, for setting the tone for this evening. It's very helpful. So let's go to the next slide here. My purpose this evening is to really bring this framework forward. This was a lot of work that the Community Council did, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that council in a moment. But the idea here is to bring a number of different ideas, programs, approaches together in a way that they work together and provide us with an actionable plan for both the short term and the long term. I want to really thank all of the task force members in your various groups for the work you've done to bring together just sort of a whole, I don't know, tub full of resources. And it's kind of overwhelming to look at those resources and ask, how are we going to make those function together? So one of the things I think that this task force has to, that our community council has to offer the task force is a way of thinking about all those resources so that they might work together and find ways to prioritize at the right time different approaches and then move to other approaches when that's necessary. So let's go to the next slide there. The Community Council formed in the spring of 2019. It was an offshoot of a group called Tenderloin Think Tank that had been meeting for about 2 years prior to that. The think tank had been meeting in the afternoons and moved to evenings so it could accommodate more people who were interested specifically in these issues related to street level drug dealing. We met probably 2-3 times a month up until the pandemic hit, and then started meeting once a month back in October. Our email list consists of about 75 people. Typically at the face-to-face meetings, we had 25 to 30 people at every meeting. They were Tenderloin residents, business owners, nonprofit people, people who identified as people of color, Black, Indigenous, Asian Pacific, all kinds of people. Sometimes as many as half, if not 3/4, identified as queer or gender fluid or non-binary. Many were long-term residents of the neighborhood, and those that weren't residents had been working in the neighborhood for a long time. So they were people who shared a lot in common as far as loving and caring about the neighborhood, but they also saw different elements of the community. And this was a group of people that very much understand that there is no single Tenderloin community, and in fact rejected the idea that this was the Tenderloin Community Council and called themselves a community council. They also really focused on knowing that there'd be conflicts between different points of view. So that's where we could look at the next slide then. And the purpose of this group was really to talk honestly about those multiple communities and multiple points of view, get a sense of where we did agree and where we didn't agree, and find ways to work together. Identify those harms related to open air drug sales, and we'll talk about those to some extent, but when we had those conversations, we sometimes had 50, 75 listed specific items that could be categorized into different groups, but there were a lot of different harms that people saw, and sometimes what one person saw as a harm was somebody else might see as either neutral, not such a big deal, or maybe even a benefit. Those were some of the places we had difficult conversations. Ultimately, though, because this community council was formed to support the task force and to engage with the issues around the task force, it identified its purpose as being to review and evaluate and then advocate for effective ways to address the harms that we held in common. So we can look at the next slide then. We participated in the City Hall hearings in April of 2019. We also negotiated for broader representation on the task force. The original legislation really focused on representatives from the criminal system as opposed to the broader community. And I'm, again, very grateful to all of you who are sitting on this task force for representing so many different areas of expertise, lived experience, and life experience. We also negotiated for really focusing more on the harms related to the market rather than trying to move straight towards elimination of the market. And I want to talk about that for just a moment because it was an important distinction for the community council. Many people saw a need to reduce the harms and reduce the impact of the market on our neighborhood. But there are many people who express both a dependence on the market that's out there, but also the fear that an attempt to eliminate the market in a one swell sort of movement or one drastic effort would be to create a lot more harms than the current market is facing the community. So the community council really focused itself on how do we move towards the harms that are represented by the market and not necessarily eliminating the market right away. It wasn't that people felt like we should always preserve the market, but just recognizing that it was a more ambivalent goal, that one of elimination. And I just want to be honest about that was the perspective of this group of people. So next slide. I think all of us recognize that there is greater urgency today. We're aware of the increases in violence that we're seeing, more shootings, more stabbings, the disturbing news that the farmers market is in jeopardy because it is really struggling to survive in the face of increased property crimes and violence that's down there. We're also seeing dramatic increases in overdoses. I heard from Urban Alchemy the other day that in our area, they are doing 2+ overdose reversals every day, and we certainly know that there are many more than that are happening. We also know that COVID has changed who is on the streets and for what purpose. 2 years ago, you would have seen a much more pluralistic group of people on the streets in various ways, people walking to work, people riding their bicycles, families out going one direction or another, elders going to the park for Tai Chi. Many of those people are feeling they can't be on the streets or aren't in the streets because they aren't working in the neighborhood any longer. So that has distilled the group of people who are on the streets at this point and has disrupted what has been a historical balance. And that creates a different kind of urgency for us to do this work. So overall, we're experiencing a loss of life, a loss of businesses. I will say for myself, my favorite shirt laundry is now long gone. There are lots of things that are changing in the neighborhood that have changed because of COVID, but also because of this change of balance in the neighborhood. And I would say overall, we're experiencing between COVID and everything else, a kind of loss of stability. And that is a really big issue I think we need to keep in the midst of our conversations. So I'd go to the next slide, please. When we talk about the disagreements that we have, sometimes it's worthwhile to just acknowledge what assumptions we come with. And we can say we might disagree with each other about those assumptions, that there are some things that I experience that you may not, and there are some things that you may believe are inherent to human nature that I may not. But if we can put those assumptions on the table, it can help us to identify why we're having certain disagreements or why we feel like we're not making progress. So these are the assumptions that the Community Council laid out on the table as we began talking about what we were hoping would happen. One is that the drug market has existed for decades and that it is getting worse, that it's growing in its intensity and its density. And one of the things I want to acknowledge in that, especially in light of COVID, is that the Tenderloin has become something of the market for the Bay Area, where other areas are shutting down or people are really withdrawing and increasing their drug use. The Tenderloin is now bearing a burden for the rest of the Bay Area that it wasn't a year ago or 2 years ago. And I think that's worth paying attention to. Tom used the term, we are a traumatized community, and a traumatized community is kind of a term that Dr. Howard Pinderhughes really focused his work on, and I'm hoping he'll come and talk to us at some point. But it has three characteristics. One is it has dysfunctional relationships. That is, people aren't necessarily supporting one another, or they are engaging in behaviors that are harming one another. And those dysfunctional relationships are between authorized governmental agencies, businesses, individuals, families. I mean, the dysfunctions appear in all different kinds of ways. There is a decay in the environment, which we heard Randy Shaw talk about, that buildings aren't cared for, parking lots aren't cared for. And then there's also a lack of economic opportunity and a lack of economic investment. And I think in the Tenderloin, we see all three of those characteristics. And part of what that makes us, should direct us to think about, is that even as we address the issues of the open air drug market, we have to pay attention to these other symptoms of a traumatized community and ask ourselves, what is it we need to do to address the trauma that is below all of these things? And then finally, that these conditions didn't occur overnight. This is not something that appeared a year ago, 2 years ago, or even 10 years ago. 20 years ago, when Faithful Fools was founded, the corner of Turk and Hyde was the place to go for black tar heroin. And a week after Carmen and Kay, who are the founders of Faithful Fools, moved into their building at 234 Hyde Street, the building next door, 222, which famous techno club and jazz club and so on. A meth lab blew up on the second floor, nearly took out the entire building, killed one person. So, 22, 23 years ago, that was the case as well. So it's not like this is new. It just is continuing to ebb and flow and become, in some ways, more severe at this point. So we can go to the next slide then. Further assumptions are that law enforcement treatment are equally important, and I think Tom was alluding to this, and I've heard this in other conversations. We have to really look at different ways to meet the needs and to address the behaviors that are there without necessarily saying one is the answer or another is. And I would also suggest that they will shift in their balances as we go along. Sometimes one will be more important than another, and then there will be other strategies that will even be more important than either of these. Also, participants in the market itself must be engaged. The people who are in the thick of it are the people who know more about the solutions than probably we do, and we really need to pay attention to that. I think we also have to pay attention to how success is going to be measured. And, we need to really look at how many overdoses are there? What do arrests look like? What are the deaths on the street? Those kinds of objective measures. How many assaults do we see? What's property damage? But we also need to measure the subjectively. We need to do some focus groups and some surveys to ask people, how safe do you feel? There is every 3 years a community health needs assessment. And in that assessment, they do ask people, how safe do you feel? And our neighborhood is one of the places where people feel the least safe in San Francisco. We need to pay attention to those subjective measures, because even if we did everything we could to change the dynamics on the streets, if people still don't feel safe, we won't have met the needs of our community. Obviously, the problem can't be dealt with in isolation. And I want to thank David Elliott Lewis for really bringing to me the need to say very specifically that poverty is a driver of this, and that if we ignore poverty in the midst of everything we're talking about in the Tenderloin, then we will really not be able to address the problems we're talking about. So we could go on to the next slide then. So we spent a lot of time in the community council talking about harms and concerns related to the open air drug market. So, if we put the open air drug market in the middle, I like to say these are the behaviors that are sort of surrounding it. If you're walking down the street, these are things that if you could see both the visible and the invisible, these are the things that you would see. And this is really what people named. Although, as I said, there were probably 75 or 100 different things that were on the lists that we developed. They're sort of categorizable in this way. And probably the most significant is violence. You know, that's the thing that people say the most often and the most quickly, is that there is a feeling that there is implied and actual violence around them. And you may ask people, have you ever been the subject of violence in our neighborhood? And they may say very well say no, but I always am on my toes. I'm always worried about it. So there is a sense that there is violence in the air. There's also a kind of violence related to the property loss and that's related to theft, graffiti, you know, just general behaviors that damage property. But beyond that, we also see deteriorating public health, the overdoses, visible wounds. There's also spreads of Hep C and other diseases that come with drug use. They're less visible, but just as debilitating. We also have the unpredictable behaviors that come with it. Some of them are related to actually using, people who are anxious about whether they're being seen using, or you know, how they're going to go about doing it. Sometimes it's related to actually being high. Sometimes people who are panicked about getting a dose before they start to experience withdrawal can behave erratically. And then we have a lot of mental health issues that people are addressing themselves through their own regime of medication. All of this comes together in the form of interfering with daily life. For members of our community, you know, whether it's youth, families, businesses, people in recovery, we see interference with daily life. And in particular for our youth of color, there are really huge issues of, on the one hand, feeling as though the only role models available, or the predominantly successful ones, are people who are selling drugs and engaging in other illegal activities. And so that sense of not having multiple choices of who you might grow up to be is really a strong issue. There's also an issue, too, that people haven't talked about very much, which is about seeing family members use drugs on the streets. And that happens as well. And it is particularly poignant for African-American families and for Latino families, where you have family members that you want to help, but are not, the resources just aren't there. And it is a deeply traumatic part of the experience of our drug market, and we really need to think about that. I'd go on to the next slide now. And you might think this is the same slide, but it's not. I put poverty and homelessness in the middle of it because the reality is, with a few changes and a few differences, all of these things surround poverty and homelessness in our neighborhood as well. The unpredictabilities are more related to trauma and widespread untreated mental health concerns and behavioral health concerns. The interference with daily life has multiple sources, but it's often very much the same, as that lack of opportunity, congested sidewalks, stability, lack of economic possibilities and investments. The deteriorating public health is huge. In San Francisco, the average citizen can expect to live to be 81 or 82 years old. In the Tenderloin, the average citizen can expect to live to be 58 or 59 years old. There is a dramatic difference in our life expectancy in this neighborhood, and that is related to homelessness, poverty, and everything that goes with it, including our open-air drug market and the violence that we have implicit in our neighborhood. So if we put these two slides together, I just want you to recognize that the drug market, homelessness, and poverty all together really reach to many of the same harms, and that we need to address them together. We can't say only this and only that, but if we look at the harms, we need to recognize that we need to address those in a very coordinated way. So the next slide, please. So in the Tenderloin framework, one of the things that we say is that chronic underinvestment and over-enforcement have created ongoing chronic conditions in the Tenderloin. These conditions are in part the result of historical racism and ongoing structural racism. And I hope at some moment we have a very in-depth and detailed conversation about the ways in which structural racism has impacted our neighborhood. But I just want to go back and say it started, you know, many, many decades ago with redlining, with lack of equal employment. It's occurred with urban renewal in our community, and then with the war on drugs, which has clearly resulted in the arrest and the consequences of incarceration much more dramatically hitting our African American neighbors than it has any other community. I am always struck by the number of people I talk to in the streets who are my Black and African American neighbors who talk about wanting employment. And then as we talk about what the barriers are educational, they're related to incarceration, they're related to wages. All of those are things that are just huge and have a deep relationship with the drug market. So any initiative we take really has to take this into account. And I believe that we need an accountability and repair process that is ancillary to anything else that we do in order to make sure that every initiative we have addresses race and racism at its core. So let's go on to the next slide. I want to say that the plan should be actionable and effective, multifaceted, building on existing resources, and accountable to the entire community. And just having said that, I know I'm running a little short on time, so I want to just go on to the next slide and move towards some plans that we might be able to put in place. The first is that every plan needs to have really 5 components in it, or at least acknowledge 5 different elements. One is harm reduction, which Sasha talked about at the beginning. And one of the things I want to say about harm reduction is implicit in it is the recognition that it's not always possible to eliminate harmful behavior just immediately. For people who have experienced addiction, they know that it's very hard to say, tomorrow, that's my last drink. Tomorrow, it's my last hit. Eliminating a behavior that you're not happy with on a dime is very difficult to do. So often what we do is try to reduce the strategies related to that harm to set the stage for meaningful change. And sometimes that change includes elimination and complete abstinence, but sometimes it means just completely changing in ways that include the harmful behavior, but in much reduced ways so that the harm is not as devastating to the individual or those who care about the individual. We also need to have trauma-informed systems, which is actually in the legislation. But I just want to point out that trauma-informed systems and thinking increases and maximizes success. So when we see HSOC, for example, the Healthy Streets Operations Center, when they started to operate much more with a trauma-informed perspective, offering multiple choices to people on the streets when they were talking about resolving tent encampments, of making sure that they were really moving at a pace that the individual needed, giving people a sense of authority and control. Their success rate at getting people to move in different areas and to receive services went from about 25% to well over 50%, and then now much more recently has even exceeded that. So we see a maximization of success when we really incorporate informed systems in whatever process we use. We also need to really focus on anti-violence programming. Anti-violence programming looks at interrupting cycles of violence rather than trying to clean up after them. And that's a really critical part of the picture. We have so many concerns about violence that we really need to be explicit in how we want to address that. And then we also want to look at restorative justice. And in large part, that's because our criminal system isn't really able to give people a sense of being restored when they've been harmed. And whether that harm is physical violence to one's body or a property crime, we need to feel whole after we've been violated. That is, we need to have something restored to us, but we also need to feel more confidence that what has happened to us won't happen to us or our loved ones. And that often only happens when we really hold somebody accountable and their behavior changes. Our criminal system sometimes changes behavior and sometimes doesn't. And there are some things we can do in our own community to really bring about more behavioral changes. And all of that needs to be integrated with and backed up by police engagement and in coordination. I will tell you, I saw last spring when the pandemic first hit, in the first few weeks, our police officers really struggled with how to be engaged with the community and yet at the same time not expose themselves great risk from COVID itself, which meant that policing changed and was reduced in a lot of ways. And we saw a lot of struggles and difficulty that came in the vacuum that was left. Thankfully, the police did re-engage, and we are, still connected with them. But I think police engagement hasn't been as coordinated with or in as clear communication with the community as is necessary in order to be effective. So if you'll go on to the next slide, I'll talk about how these things can actually be put into play. Because, it's one thing to have these categories of thought. It's another to think about how do you actually do this? And I know that we are charged with really looking at what do we do in a short term and in a long term. And in a short term process, I think one of the things I would encourage all of us to do is to put together a coordinating body, create a strategy that includes community stakeholders, residents, businesses, people from the streets with lived experience, all kinds of people, including community-based organizations and, yes, city agencies from enforcement and health and welfare, all of those different groups. And on the one hand, to be able to coordinate the existing community-based services and resources with law enforcement, improve communication, map and align those resources together so they actually function together. One of our most immediate and short-term needs is making sure that we leverage all the resources that we have. And there are very specific strategies that we should use to do that. We need a planner and a project manager who can really oversee these things and see how they fit together. This coordinating body should also identify short-term high-priority goals, both by location, where are the places where there's the greatest suffering, and where we can get the maximum improvement. And that might be things like balancing the needs of Turk and Hyde versus the UN Plaza and the farmers market, to really focus on what is it we need and set those goals clearly. And then flowing out of that body, we need to really focus on the COVID-related initiatives that have produced some short-term outcomes. The safe streets where people are able to walk and hang out, the TL plan, which resulted in reducing the number of tents from over 450 to about 50, and then also making sure that there are HSOC and HOT resources. So, and even advocate that some of the SIP hotels be more available so that when people are in real need and real distress, we have alternatives other than arrest and hospitalization for them. So these are things that a coordinating body could do. I would encourage that it be not a city body, that it be really housed under somebody outside the city so that it's more flexible and has more, is able to be more nimble. But has community accountability. I'd go to the next slide there. So what might that look like, if there are coordinated efforts? Well, let's think about some of the calming activities that we've seen. We've seen the police arrive and do a calming activity, an occupation for 3 or 6 hours, a couple or 3 days in a row. We've also seen HSOC remove tents. We've seen HOT identify particular areas where people are in need. And often what happens is those calming activities occur and then there's nothing. And it's not at all, everything just moves right back in. So it's almost like you see the wave come in and the wave go out. And what it leaves behind is a sense of instability. If we use that trauma-informed way of thinking, what we can say is that creates a moment of calm followed by unpredictable instabilities, which means that we're not really reducing the amount of trauma that's there or the amount of agitation. We're just creating little pockets of calm. If we were to prepare other resources to be coordinated both before and after these calming activities happen, we would, I think, see greater impact from them. We would see longer days, longer periods of time when there's calm, but also an increasing sense of trust that stability can return. We'd also want this coordinating body to have some mechanism to monitor the given areas where these activities occur and see if there are upticks in undesirable behaviors. And if that's the case, then to be able to marshal from the coordinated point of view, the central point of view, what are the resources that are necessary to address the upticks? So if what's happened in an area that's been cleared or has been calmed is there's an uptick in tents, you want a different response than if there's an uptick in a density of dealers. And that's where a coordinated response would really make a difference. The other thing it might do is that body would do is to look at safe sleeping sites and existing encampments and ask, how do we support them and monitor them and make them more stable so that they are not as easily targeted by abusive forces. And what we have seen in some of the safe sleeping sites is when they are not well supported, they do get overcome with drug dealing and chop shops. So what ends up happening is that there's more violence, including sexual violence, that is used to intimidate people. If we are to calm these sites, we could also make them as kind of islands in the midst of the market and really look at ways in which they could then spread out from there. That calm could spread out from there. And again, people in those safe sleeping sites and existing encampments, as their trauma is being addressed, as their agitation is being addressed, we would also see increased stability on the streets. We need to use outreach teams like the care ambassadors to really, with credibility, monitor and address problems directly, find out where there are particular vulnerabilities to violence, to coercion, and those kinds of things, so that we can address those concerns quickly. And then finally, enhance harm reduction, street medicine, and other services to the stabilized areas in the neighborhood, so that those are areas that really can maintain themselves. And if that's the case, then drug activity that are around those areas will be reduced. And we've seen that in a number of instances where we've been able to see stabilized areas become less agitated. I understand from the Harm Reduction Therapy Center, there have been places where after they set up and provide services for days afterwards, there is less destructive behavior, less self-destructive behavior, instances of drunkenness and out of control behaviors. So those are bits of evidence that this kind of approach can work. And then one more slide there, I think. So then to look at a 6 to 12 month using all of these resources to continue that coordinating body, but in the final part of the first year of it, to really define 3 to 5 year goals and identify and advocate for the resources necessary to do that, to work with Matt Haney's office and other nonprofits and agencies to really advocate for the amount of money and people and appropriate resources, design evaluation and accountability systems. I think UCSF and the Bonhoeff Housing and Homeless Initiative might well be able to work with that to help us to identify the better ways to evaluate and be accountable there. I think this in those 6 to 12 months, we need to produce a real strategic plan that really clearly identifies priorities and strategies, continuing to leverage what we already have, but identify what we need to develop. And then finally, we need to monitor and support those existing initiatives, the things that we started with in the previous 3 to 6 months. I want to say, and that's my last slide, but I just want to say there are certainly some things that are left out here. You know, the community council didn't have all the answers by any means. No one's going to, but certainly things like employment are missing. The larger regional analysis is missing. You know, how do we address that question of the Tenderloin becoming the market for the Bay Area? What do we do on the international level? How do we address unauthorized immigrants, people who are trafficked? The relationship between this market and the human trafficking market. I mean, there are a variety of things that are not addressed in this body of material. But my hope is that as a framework, a way of thinking about what's missing, where can it be inserted, it allows us to think in a systematic way, but also a compassionate way about how we can take steps towards what it is we want to accomplish. So rather than trying to do everything in one quick step, to really move towards relief. I've often heard people say that we need to act and we need to do it quickly. And I've been hearing that for 10 years, and I know it's been said for much longer. I think now is our option and our opportunity to be able to say, as hard as it is, we need to slow down, take a deep breath, and do this in a systematic way, and then insist that the city and other resources support us in a step-by-step process, and that we are grounded in community voices. We recognize the history of race and racism, the systematic systems of poverty and violence that have infiltrated our community, and that hasn't happened overnight, but we will be here for a long time, and we will address those problems in a compassionate and humane way, but with real steadiness and determination. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Sam, so much. Really appreciate the wisdom from the Tenderloin Community Council. There's a Dr. Eiton, who is a public health expert in the Bay Area, says professionals are technocrats and communities are Democrats, and we must embrace democracy to truly mend the problems we're addressing. And I think you just beautifully showed how important it really is for us to ensure that we're adequately incorporating community into our process. So thank you very much. With that, we'll open it up for task force members to ask any questions. I would love for you to raise your hands, starting with Tom. Let's go, please, raise your hands and we'll go through the list.
Thank you. Sam, so I just have to ask, how come you weren't on this task force? Because that was a brilliant presentation that was like, man, you should just take those ideas, Bo, and just submit them. There you go. I mean, it was that good. So thank you. It was awesome. Talk about being in touch with the community. I was super impressed. I did have one question. You brought up a great point about how the Tenderloin, because of COVID, has become kind of like the epicenter in the Bay Area for kind of the drug market that's going on. And we've seen that some in the news, people in Santa Rosa overdosing with drugs they bought in the Tenderloin, et cetera. Have you also noticed the demographic change a little bit? Because when I'm out there, I kind of noticed like it just seems like there's more people, they're younger, people that I mean, I know it's changed. It changes all the time. The Tenderloin is kind of fluid, but there's always kind of that same group of OGs that are kind of out there. But now there's this whole new young group of people that they see. It seems like they're coming from regional areas, maybe up north or the valley or something like that, and coming out here. And I just wondered if you maybe noticed that, and if is that impacting what you see day to day out there. Thank you.
Well, I'll just say I have always seen an ebb and flow of younger people, and that's always depended on what's happened around Golden Gate and Haight-Ashbury. But the other difference is the drive-up traffic is now younger and more wealthy. I mean, Carmen reports seeing the same Jaguar pull up in front of our building every morning. Like there is a degree of wealth that is driving by now, and the traffic pattern has been disrupted and now is funneled more down Hyde Street because of a variety of traffic patterns within the neighborhood. But I think, the biggest, if you want to call it demographic change, is the drive up. That really is it. And I think that just having younger and more white people who are hanging out on the streets just has to do with the sweeps in the rest of the city at this point.
Great. Thank you. So we'll move to Judith and then Rachel.
Thank you. Sam, thanks so much for your presentation. It's very thought-provoking, and obviously a lot of community work went into it, and I really appreciate hearing about it. I had a couple questions. And this is probably somewhat speculative, but the first one though isn't. And I wondered if in your work in the community, did you include people from the market who are actually selling drugs? Because we hear that they don't live in the community. So how can we talk to them, or do you have any good ideas about that?
So there are a couple of different elements. One is the people that I know who are sellers never came into the community council, even though I would occasionally invite them. And there's a whole range of reasons why, that have to do with the barrier of a threshold of entering into a building is just huge, no matter who it is. those, well, so there are different cadres of drug dealers, and certainly I've heard the phrase, they are not from here or they're not part of our community. There certainly are the commuter drug dealers, and they are much harder to engage. I understand there's some other organizations that have actually been having some good sit downs with them recently, and at some point we can talk about that. I don't want to go into too much detail of how that's functioning right now. There were people, though, who living on the streets and that I have direct relationships with, more African Americans, that again, few came into the meetings, but we would stop and have conversations on the way out or hanging out. So their thoughts are represented in small margin here. But I think what we really have to do is to pay attention to community activists who have those connections, who have family on the street, who have family that are actively engaged in the market, and really ask them, how do we engage this, and how do we set up a safe venue for doing that? That's a long-term project in my mind, because there is a lot of trust that needs to be built. And right now, there is very little trust between the people who are, really committed to being on the streets and actively involved with the entirety of the life on the streets and civic structures. I think, people who are in street medicine will tell you that there is a certain cadre of people that they get to know easily enough, but there are others who they still cannot engage. So that part of the question, I think, is one we should take very seriously, but really pull together the right people to do it and to empower them, fund them, and make sure that we keep that front and center in the strategy.
Thank you. The other question I had is about income disparity, and I was thinking about Naomi Klein and how disasters like the COVID pandemic sort of re-emphasize certain things about income that make poor people poorer and rich people richer. And of course, we've already seen that for several years now in San Francisco. And I think that, I'm not sure, but I think it affects neighborhoods like the Tenderloin, in that people with mostly a suburban experience move in and buy buildings, and they don't become part of the community anymore. And I don't know if that's true. Do people in the community feel that or not? Or is that happening at all? And I'm concerned that the COVID epidemic will make it worse.
So in 2010, 11, when there was the Twitter tax break, that really unleashed gentrification in the neighborhood, and we've seen a fair amount of that. San Francisco, is a sway back rather than a curve, right? We have lots of people who are above $250,000 and a lot of people who are in the bottom third, and we don't have enough people in the middle class. And I think San Francisco as a whole is living with that. The low-income housing that is concentrated in the Tenderloin and areas like the Bayview as well tend to preserve the sort of the containment zone, or the old term, the ghetto. There are different ways to talk about it. So yes, there is some of that sense of people moving in, but they're not middle income people. They're very high income people. But there still is housing that they won't move into, and it creates greater divides. So it's a complicated question you're asking there. What it does do is force more life onto the streets. The more people who are homeless and not allowed to exist in other parts of the city, the more dense the streets become. And so the more obvious and painful becomes the poverty, as well as the racial segregation. And that, I think, is where we see the increasing human suffering. It puts a greater pressure on people living inside. It's hugely destructive for the people who are living outside. And then, for the rest of the city, it's painful as well.
Thank you.
And Judith, if you can lower your hand for me, and then Rachel, you were next in line.
Sure. Thank you so much for the presentation. I wanted to ask, it might be too big of a question to talk about in a quick space right here, but you described needing an equal need for law enforcement alongside treatment. And I'm wondering how you see that as being balanced with the reality, as you described it, of needing to provide trauma-informed responses and accountability for racism and class divides as well.
Okay, yeah, so there is a way in which we need to really rethink enforcement, and it's a really complicated issue, obviously. But I will just say the most simple example that I can think of where we need to rethink and how we can rethink it is, the war on drugs focused on the idea that if we disrupt markets, drugs will become more expensive and fewer people will use them. It was this sort of straight out market analysis. And what we've seen over time is that disruption has had no impact on the price of drugs. In fact, the price of drugs over the last 40 years have dramatically dropped, and certainly has had no impact on the number of people who use various substances. In fact, that has dramatically increased. But what has happened is that disruption is an inherently destabilizing factor for communities. And that is one of the primary factors in causing what Dr. Pinder Hughes calls a traumatized community. So if we want to look at law enforcement as being a partner in all of this, we need to, one, have a trauma-informed system around it. And so say, law enforcement is not disruptive, should not be disruptive. It should be about stabilizing, and it should be about creating a sense of security. So if we were to shift the direction of law enforcement away from drug enforcement and onto really focusing on preventing and addressing violence where it is, we would see a stabilizing factor come in. So rather than having the police command center be at the epicenter of a drug activity, to have some security that moves around encampments where it's clear there won't be arrests for drugs, but that violence won't be tolerated. And that the idea is that the police are there to actually stabilize the encampment rather than to disrupt it. Now, that's a long distance away from what police do today, and it's a long distance away from what they understand their mandate to be. But I think, again, this is from my own perspective, there are some failings human beings have. And in an ideal world, we would be able to prevent all violence. We would be able to ensure everybody's safety without incarcerating anyone. But in reality, we are living in a moment where there are people whose behavior is very unpredictable. And there are some times when it is our failing as a community, we don't know how to stop certain kinds of violence. And I think still for a period of time, we'll need some form of policing that addresses that particular issue. And we need to have a framework around that. That's a long way of saying, I wish that I could see a place where we don't have police enforcement in a year or 2 years, but I do see the need for it. Again, just given my experience a year ago when police withdrew, and there really was chaos, and the pain of the violence that came into that chaos because people were unstable and really struggling for resources, meant that we really were in a, what you classically would call a lawless situation. And that's where I think we need to say, okay, there is a balance and a place for enforcement, but it has to be in real collaboration and coordination, and there has to be deep communication and deep accountability, both for the community and for law enforcement, so that it is used effectively rather than disruptively. And I would say that's my point of view. I don't know that many members of the community council would say that. Let me just say that.
Thank you so much again, Sam. Looks like a question.
Okay. Sorry, it took me a minute to figure out unmute. Sam, I just wanted to say thank you for that presentation. That was really awesome. I think you did a marvelous job of sort of articulating and representing the work that the community council have done. And I really hope that we can find ways to sort of incorporate the framework of this around the work that we're trying to do, and really think about all of our recommendations in this sort of framework and in really how it all fits together, because I think that that's exactly the kind of structure that we need in order to make anything that we propose out of this group actually have meaningful impact. It needs to be in a framework such as what you presented, and I think you did a great job of articulating what the community council had, the work that they had done. So thank you very much for being here and doing that. We really appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Thanks. If you, okay, perfect. So if there aren't any other questions or comments from the task force, I'm gonna leave room for any lingerers. Looks like that's, oh, okay, Max.
Hey, I actually also echo the fact that that was a great presentation. I like the framework of it. But I also kind of wanted to jump back a little bit to what Tom was talking about earlier. When Tom, and I had a question for Tom and Sasha for you guys as well. When you were out on the street and talking to people, in your experience, what kind of feedback did you guys get?
Do you answer?
Well, you know, so you got to understand that when you're on the streets of the Tenderloin and you're talking to someone that's unhoused and they're struggling with addiction, like I was as an example, they're going to have a very different response than a business owner. So when I walked into the donut shop on Golden Gate and Larkin and I talked to them, you know, they're in survival mode. Now, they're just trying to keep their business afloat because they had to close for a while. And I know from just previous past lived experience, the kind of stuff, the kind of trauma that they have to put up with, that they have to deal with on the daily from people that are coming in varying states of crisis into their business, right? But at the same time, let's face it, let's be honest, the people that are unhoused in the Tenderloin also live in that community as well. And they're also in some type of their view on things is a little bit different. When you're living on the street, you look at the world totally different than if you're housed or you're running a business or something like that. So I kind of just want to take the middle ground on that, Max. It's just hard, though, to engage people when they're nodding out because they're high on fentanyl. And I kind of really have pivoted my advocacy work to really focusing on that and how we can do things to reduce harms around that. Because really, you know, Sam was talking about the drug dealers that she has engaged. The drug dealers that are the commuter dealers, and we've talked about this before, which are the Honduran dealers that are out there, there's very limited engagement with those guys. I mean, I've had some engagement with them, but it's pretty limited, and they certainly won't talk to law enforcement, and a lot of community providers they won't talk to either because they kind of just, you know, they're there, it's business for them, they're at work. So now you're disrupting their job. They can't make money, and that's really kind of what it comes down to. So it's really complicated. Your question could go in like 5 different directions in how to address it, but it's just hard when you're down on the street and there's so many people in crisis mode, and it's the people that are living on the street, it's people that are in the community, and there's people that are trying to have their livelihood, and they're all struggling at the same time. So it's really hard. So I know that probably doesn't answer it, but that's the best I got. Thanks.
Yeah, and I can just follow up. I mean, to be honest, Max, this was just the first time that we stepped out to pass flyers out to say, hey, there's this task force that exists. If you haven't heard about it already, here are the different ways that you can engage the task force. So I'd say, you know, for us, it was a first step to get out, walk around, inform. And, you know, the next step in question is, what is the best way to engage these, you know, multiple populations that are experiencing different levels of harm in the community, and recognizing that we just walked through the Tenderloin. You know, we didn't go to 6th Street. We didn't go to other neighborhoods that are also part of this larger task force focus. So there's definitely room for opportunity and room for growth, and we're committed to doing that. So I know it's 6:20 and want to leave time for public comment. We will ensure that if folks have their hands raised, we're gonna get to everyone.
I wanted to add just one thing if possible, Sasha.
Oh, sorry. Okay, please.
I promise I will try to be as short as I can. So
okay, you'll hear my bell if it's too long.
Okay. So just, again, I want to thank Sam. The presentation was absolutely wonderful and the insight was very, very, it made a lot of sense. One of the things that was brought up, I really like the fact that there should be better coordination of services, I think, between the police and the community. And, you know, when we are creating areas of calm, there should be some opportunity for intervention. There should be some opportunity for engagement that I think we're missing out on. So I do appreciate that feedback. I took notes on that, and I think that is a great recommendation. You know, what I struggle with is when we're told that we're over enforcing or that because I find it, unfortunately, like when you look at 699 deaths from last year, I mean, I consider this a emergency, and really I see our role in the enforcement part critical to it. I think it's critical to calming the area. I think it's critical when we talk about engagement. Sometimes the best engagement happens when somebody is removed from that environment and given a chance. And it doesn't have to be long. Like, people sometimes think that all cops want to do is lock up people forever. We don't. We really, really don't. If there was a way around it, I would love for that to happen. But I know the reality. I've walked the footbeat in the Tenderloin. I've worked in narcotics. I've worked in undercover capacity. I've worked as commanding officer of Bayview Park Station, Haight-Ashbury. I mean, there were people there that I know it's trauma that causes a majority of them for being out on the street. So how do we help them? That sometimes that engagement happens in a controlled environment when they aren't high, when they aren't influenced by, I hate to use the word, but the drug dealers are predators. They are predators. They are hurting the community. They are hurting the people that have these, that have the drug problems, that have the addiction, and it almost doesn't give them a chance. And so that's just what I wanted to add, but I do appreciate the presentation. I actually think there were some really good points made on it. Thank you, that's all.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe just, I mean, just thanks for acknowledging the opportunity to collaborate and work together. And I think, you know, the spirit of this conversation, the spirit of this presentation, and the opportunity is to identify where are there opportunities to support the work that each of you are doing in these communities. And you know, to your point, you know, I know there are folks on the task force who don't disagree with you. I think there are also, you know, members of the task force that may feel like we'd love to see other options that folks can, you know, experience to help them, you know, make a different choice once they're no longer, you know, under the influence of a substance. And, you know, I think this is where the conversation, you know, leveraging our understanding of evidence-based solutions and our understanding of the community and each of your expertise to really identify what's the possible way forward, knowing that, again, what each of us or each of you have been doing won't work in isolation, and there really are opportunities for collaboration and to identify new ways to work together. So I'm really excited to hear about your you know, willingness to explore, you know, what that looks like, and I think, you know, obviously some of this work has to happen offline. I know we've gotten comments from the community that can be frustrating, and there's no way that we'll be able to come together and provide all of these recommendations without really rolling up our sleeves and doing the work in between meetings. So looking forward to what that follow-up looks like for all of us to work together and identify the ways that we can collaborate. So thank you. With that, just going back to public comment. So again, each speaker will be allowed 2 minutes to speak. And a call at 415-655-0001, as you can see here. And then the code, the access code is 146-450-9707 in the event that you're not actually looking at the screen. There is a confidential email address if you'd like to send a confidential note for public comment at District 6, ideas@gmail.com. And also, if you prefer to send a confidential text, you can send it to 415-483-9005. So with that, I'm going to move to open it up for David Elliott Lewis, who's the first in line of our public.
Thank you. This is David Elliott Lewis, and thank you, Sam Dennison, for an outstanding presentation that's well informed based on so many community discussions. The only thing I wanted to elaborate on and expand on the presentation we heard are the solutions, things that we can actually do that are discrete. And they involve engagement on the street in a positive way. And I divide the types of engagement, the three types: roving, stationary, and dispatched. By dispatched, I mean dispatched by 911 or 311. And I don't mean the police. It could be dispatched, the new CART SF team, that's the Compassionate Alternative Response Team, and I'll be happy to present on that in a future meeting. I'm part of the work group that put it together. Dispatch street medicine, dispatched street crisis response teams. But the other things we can do are roving groups, roving ambassadors, urban alchemy or care ambassadors, or roving community safety patrols. Maybe based on the old model of the guardian angels, but improved for modern day standards. And finally, stationary activation. By stationary, I'm referring to putting an ambassador behind a card table with resources similar to what happened at the Lower Polk Community Benefit District did with Sergeant Macaulay Park. For quite a while, there was a pop-up tent with a table and an ambassador with literature that provided access to housing and healthcare and other helpful information. And that ambassador, he dispensed water as well. And that is an example of sort of stationary activation. You can have that many examples. So I hope you'll consider both dispatch, roving, and stationary activations. David Elliott Lewis, that is my comment. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. We'll move to the next caller, call in user 9. You have 2 minutes.
Hi, my name is Zach. I'm a disability advocate and community organizer. First, I'd like to make note that this meeting is completely inaccessible. The meeting ID was not shared for the WebEx platform, so I could not visually view this meeting or access any of the slides visually. Also, the website where this was announced doesn't even say who's hosting this meeting. I have no idea who I'm talking to. Third, there was no contact for anyone to reach with these accessibility concerns trying to access this meeting. I've already made a complaint with the Mayor's Office on Disability. This was a very poorly accessible meeting. Secondly, the mention of a host that 2 minutes would be kind of sort of a courtesy time in order to hear everyone, that's actually required by law under the Brown Act. So all members of the public press *3 if you want to speak. The host also did not say that, which was also a primary accessibility problem. And I'm raising these all because it's clear that the public does not want to be heard from. Why doesn't the public want to be heard from? Because we know that this is a sham. This Nixon-like war on drugs that is being enacted under Matt Haney's office and the mayor is a way to gentrify and penalize and punish the poor and the disabled, who are the primary people that are overdosing, many of which are committing suicide right now because of the unbelievable catastrophic failure that this city has made in handling the COVID-19 pandemic. As far as enforcement, I'd like to point out in 2014 that 6 San Francisco police officers were indicted on drug extortion and theft charges, and the shooting of unarmed Black youth ultimately also led to Police Chief Greg Suhr resigning after a community protest and hunger strike. So drug use is not limited to people of color and the homeless and the disabled, though that is surely who will be targeted. It is also happens with city officials. Cocaine use among tech employees is exorbitant right now. And, you know, I'd like to say more, but of course, I will not be given time for that. Thank you.
Thank you, caller, and those comments are definitely noted, and we will work to improve accessibility. So moving to the next caller, Liza.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. Sam, thank you for such a thorough presentation. Greatly appreciated. And thank you for sending the cited information. I keep hearing that, you know, whether we have individuals on the street going and doing ambassador work or outreach, the bottom line is we do not have resources. You can have all the paper you want and push it all you want and do what you want. Coming from an addict, a dealer, and someone who's 17 years clean and sober, if I would not have been picked up off the street, I would still be there. If someone didn't allow me my agency to find my agency of who I am, you can pop me with Narcan, you can do everything you want. You can come back and give me a Band-Aid the next day on my abscess. But have you touched my soul? Have you heard my story? Do you know me? Am I going to see you tomorrow? No. And by creating we have 9 street teams out doing what? The Tenderloin looks like hell. It's ridden with cartel. It needs to be separated and fixed. And you cannot fix it if you're going to put a Band-Aid on it. You cannot fix it if you're going to give somebody resources and they're not available. Who are we fooling? We don't have residential. If you're living in a community on the street and trust them, you can then learn to live in a community with a trusted house where people have the same values, the same goals, the same kind of connection, whether it be a harm reductionary approach or an abstinence. But these people are years on the street of trauma. Talking to them and saying, how you doing, is a beginning to find out who they are when you see them the next day. So having a stationary place is essential so that they can come back to you the next day and say, you know what, you sent me on a hamster trail, that nobody was there. Nobody can help me. I don't have a bed. Nobody can do this. We don't have the resources. That is the bottom line. So instead of creating more chaos on the street with all these fix-it teams, we need to create resources and residential places where people can make the choice. And if you relapse, we'll pick you up again. You'll just start again. I relapsed 4 times. I ended up in ICU. When is it going to go back? In 2012, we lost 70% of our mental health resources. Where did it go? All into HSH, the HOT team, and Healthy Streets Operations Center. I don't see any of them housing. I can give you a detailed housing data, and it's pretty pathetic. And I can also give you some of the resources. The resources available from Health Right 360 are under investigation for malpractice. What are we doing?
Thank you, caller.
My next 2 minutes. Thank you.
So next we'll move to Simon Bertrand.
Yes, hi,
You'll
can you hear
have
me?
2 minutes. Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you. Hi, my name is Simon Bertrand. I'm with the Tenderloin Community Benefit District. And I, first of all, wanted to echo a lot of the statements tonight about just we work with Sam, and it was really wonderful to hear such a succinct summary of a lot of different positions in the neighborhood. It felt very fair-minded, and I really wanted to call that out. I did want to flag that from the perspective of the public, I wish that had been the presentation at the very first meeting that this group had, and that you were more focused on solutions at the moment. We're facing a situation where the schools are going to be reopening soon, and children are going to be back on the sidewalks of the Tenderloin, walking through what everyone knows is a much more intense drug trade, and the side effects of that drug trade, the harms that drug trade is producing, feel much more intense. And I really hope that we can focus the recommendations on the kinds of engagements that David Elliott Lewis was calling out. The stationary, the roving, and the response teams. I feel like we have all of those, and it's a question of bringing resources to them and making sure that there's a coordination of effort to engage people and to a certain extent to bring some of the calm that we need for these sidewalks so that everyone can get about their daily business, but especially we're thinking about the children and families as they're coming back to school and reemerging from their homes to try to go back to the classrooms. So thank you very much. And it was a pleasure listening, but I really do hope we can focus on solutions.
Thank you very much. Well, to the next caller, Kim, you have 2 minutes.
Hello, my name is Kim Mostero. I am a resident at KCC on the corner of Leavenworth and Golden Gate. And I came here to San Francisco in 2001 from Oakland, where I was literally told that I was going to die on the streets there if I didn't get out because I was living on the streets. I have been homeless. I have lived in the shelters, and I am now in an SRO. And I am more scared of my life than I have ever been before here in the Tenderloin. The violence has grown. We talk about helping the people on the streets, but nobody wants them. And we have been unwilling to build the housing, which is not necessarily a house. We need a hospital for a lot of people that are on the streets right now. They need medical care that they do not have constant access to. I live in a roach infested place. I was just online with other people in my neighborhood. Because of COVID, our roach infestations have become so outrageous. So even when we are given an SRO, it is so infested and so lacking in the ability to get resources. That is why people go back to the street. Why live in a room with roaches attacking you all the time, where you can at least be walking on the street and not be so bad? And the streets are horrible. We can't even get the simplest thing of street cleaning. I am in an SRO and I am still fighting mental health every day of just being able to walk outside my door because of the people that I have to see that are dying on our streets around me. And they need help now, not us sitting here in a room talking about it. We need somebody out there building a hospital, because that's going to be the next step for the people that are on the streets now. There's no way they're going to be allowed regular housing. We need hospitalization again. That was all knocked out because of how they were being treated. Now we know that. Now we need access for people to have a place to be safe, to where they can be treated, as you have spoken of over and over and over again, where even when you get in an SRO, the ability to get access to resources becomes even less, because they figure you're in an SRO, you're fine. You can take care of yourself. What's wrong with you? Do you not understand that people who live in normal homes, 3 and 4 bedroom homes, and have jobs, even need mental care, need resources? Why not us? Why do our resources stop just because we get put in an SRO in 4 walls and figure you can forget about us? It can't work that way. You're missing the biggest step between the street and even an SRO, and that's a continuous hospitalization to be able to get them ability to be able to find their minds, to be able to have a conversation. We're never going to be able to do it without that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll give another moment to see if there's anyone else from the community that wants to provide a public comment. All right.
Hey, Sasha, I just wanted to point out the caller, Liza, had some nice points and interesting perspective. Please use that email address that's out there, which is district6ideas@gmail.com. That will come in, and that will get to people that need to read it, and we can incorporate it. So, and that goes for everybody listening, actually.
Great. Thank you, Max. I'm not sure if this is reorganized or might have to help me out on this. If this is reorganized or this is a new hand raised?
Nope. Nope. It's an older, it's someone who'd raised their hand before. So I think no one has raised their hand in the last minute or so. So.
Okay, great.
Mention how to raise your hand. Can someone just mention how to raise their hand, please?
Sure, I can.
So,
oh, I'm speaking from the public. Wouldn't you? I mean, do you guys know how to do it? I'm just saying, the public. If you go and you're on the WebEx, you just press the bottom of your screen, and it will say mute, start video. It will then tell you the participants and your settings. And then when you go to the little, like, there's like a little U and a little smiley face, and it says raise your hand, which I just lowered mine. Yes, no, and go faster or slower for speakers. So for the public, when I'm looking at the WebEx, I can just go ahead and raise my hand.
The public can't access the WebEx. I wasn't able to access it. For the phone, it's *3, and I don't know why the host is not telling people this. *3 if you want to raise your hand when they're calling in.
yeah, my apologies. I did mention it once and I haven't done it over and over again, so I apologize for not repeating that.
All right. Sasha, there were some other folks who just raised their hand.
Yeah. So let's start with Cheryl Shanks.
You hear me?
We can hear you. You have 2 minutes.
Okay. My name is Cheryl, and I work for TNDC. I'm an activist. I live in Illinois. First and foremost, I'm a nation. Been around for a long time and watched the Tenderloin. In the last 10 years, completely the worst that I could ever imagine. It has completely gone down. I am in recovery, and my concerns are drugs used to cause addiction. Now, the so-called drugs are double whammy. The little drugs that are in them are causing addiction, long mental illness. So that needs to be addressed. Harm reduction from the top. From the cartels who are bringing the drugs in, which appears, and I don't know just how that's being addressed, if at all. It appears to me not. So speaking of harm reduction, if we're going to speak harm reduction, that needs to be addressed. Resources, we need resources. Fine, and I appreciate it, but when it comes down to it, the hospitals are full. So, yeah, the hospitals or institutions are closed down most of them. So that needs to be addressed. The police need to play their part, and I'm really glad to hear that. People are considering, for them working together because they need to work together. The police need to be reformed, but they need to be present. They definitely need to be present. Oh, Sam Dennison, you did an absolutely wonderful job. Work on the task. People are being so I let the address drugs. Just find out what's drugs, and at least and stop people from coming.
Thank you, caller.
We need to stop causing chaos by taking drugs away from them.
Thank you. And just to let you know, Cheryl, we did have some trouble hearing you. So if it's possible for you to send, additional comments that you had to the email address, district6ideas@gmail.com, that can be really helpful to make sure that we got all your comments.
Sasha, can I just say one thing? One of the things that Really quick, one of the things I picked up from her is that the hospitals were full, but we have inpatient rehabs that do have beds available, and that's something that we need to promote more in San Francisco is the availability and the accessibility of inpatient treatment. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. So we'll move to the next caller, and apologies if I don't pronounce your name properly. Ryanon Ballard. 2 minutes begin now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure. Hi there, this is Rhiannon Baylord, and I'm with UC Hastings Law, and I just wanted to take a moment to really just appreciate all the work that has gone into this task force. And in particular, I want to appreciate Sam's presentation just now. And really, I think the framework that it suggests is such an important step forward so that we take what I understand has been so many. I also took a look at all of the various ideas that have come forth from the task force, and it's such an impressive list. But providing a framework such as the one Sam set forth tonight so well really allows us to take all of these good ideas and put them into action. And I'm so struck by the callers that have called in and spoken to what they're experiencing day in and day out in the Tenderloin. And it's just absolutely heartbreaking. And what I would just advocate for is that we take the work that's being done right now on this task force and we move towards solutions. I know Simon Bertrand with the Tenderloin CBD talked about this, and I couldn't agree with him more. It's time to start implementing. It's time to start doing. There's too many people dying on the streets right now and too many people suffering in the Tenderloin. And so I just want to ensure that all the work that's being done on this task force is being put forth into a framework that moves forward to solutions, and that the city is supportive of these efforts and understanding both the need for these resources that are being suggested and also the importance of the work that's being done. It's just absolutely critical that we take action now. Agree with everything that's been said in terms of what is happening in the Tenderloin and the suffering on a daily basis and the need to come together and to start implementing. So thank you to everyone that's involved in this effort and to the good work that's being done, and appreciate anything we can do to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, caller. So thank you. Seeing that there are no further callers, public comment is now closed, and this meeting will be adjourned. And again, just a reminder, if there are further comments that you'd like to offer, please feel free to email district6ideas@gmail.com. Again, it's district, district 6, just the number, ideas @gmail.com, or you can text at 415-483-9005. Thank you all so much for your time and for your energy.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sasha, for your work tonight. Thank you.
That's great.
Thanks, everyone.